Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Will Marion. I'm the co-founder of the Positive Group. It's great to welcome you along to today's webinar. We've had a really great uptake. It's obviously a subject that's of big interest to everyone, and particularly big welcome to everyone who's new to the webinar series. We hope you enjoy it. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, as ever. I've got with me Dr. Elle Crush, who heads up our Insights team and has done her doctorate in psychological resilience, and particularly the protective factors around that. And I'm also joined by Dr. Brian Marion, who is the other co-founder of the Positive Group, health psychologist and a medic. Good afternoon, both of you.
Hi.
Brian, Elle, today we have taken on the subject of unconscious bias and bias in general. It's a topic we've been thinking about doing on a webinar for some time, and I think that the timing seems pretty good around this. It seems to be a subject that has really grabbed the attention of the world recently. It's obviously driven from everything that's happened over the last year, and the challenges in society around racism, but also the diversity and inclusion agenda across organizations and workplaces. So it's something that we've been talking about a lot internally. We've talked to a lot of clients around, and I think it's something that's highly contentious at the moment. It seems to have been in the news a lot in the last couple of weeks. We've also had the UK government has thrown out unconscious bias training and is in a tussle with the civil servants union. We've got the Democrats and the Republicans fighting over funding for diversity training in the US. Quite recently, the chairman of KPMG has come out with some quite disparaging comments around unconscious bias generally, but also about any impact around the training. So I think it's a really topical and political topic at the moment, and it's obviously huge business as well. So we've got all sorts of businesses of all sides rolling out huge amounts of training around this. It's billion-dollar business. It's also impacting on our or being applied in our education system. I think Oxford University were in the press recently about mandating this, and there's a lot of criticism out there about the evidence around the testing and the implicit bias testing, the training around this, and there's even some suggestions that this actually can make discrimination issues worse. So this is it's a big bit of a declaration from us. I think this is a big topic. We are biased. We're going to be looking at this from the lens of psychological health. It's a complex area, but we'll certainly do our best to answer some of these fascinating questions. Let's get into this. What would be really helpful is just to get a bit of a definition of what do we mean when we talk about bias, and particularly unconscious bias.
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. So when we think about cognitive bias, this is ultimately just systematic errors in how we think. And the unconscious element just implies that we're unaware of these errors. What's really interesting is these are ultimately just part of being human, and the fact that our brain can only consciously process a certain amount of information. So if we're exposed every day per second, I think we're exposed to about 11 million pieces of information, our brain actually only consciously processes about 40 pieces. So unfortunately, one of the downsides of that is there can be sources of bias. Some of these biases are helpful, but some of them are unhelpful. And so our biases are a result of our sort of past experiences. They're a result of our cultural the cultures we live in, our motivation, our current psychological sort of mood state too. And they're also a consequence of the cognitive architecture of our brains, so how our brains are actually designed and structured, and how they work and fire, essentially, is also a source of bias. So in terms of the literature on bias, it's massive. But in terms of like cognitive biases, there's probably about 180 and counting. And so I thought I'd just quickly give a couple of examples for those of you less familiar. So there's biases such as, say, something like an optimism bias. So this is a tendency of for us to overestimate positive outcomes happening and underestimate negative outcomes happening. And so what that means is we might overestimate the sort of talents of our children, or our sort of ultimate career success, or we might sort of underestimate the chances of us getting divorced or being in a car accident. So that's an example of optimism bias. And I think the crucial point here is that these sort of errors in our thinking are actually driving decisions and behaviours. So that's the ultimate reason that biases can cause concern. And then there's a bias such as the affinity bias. So this is the tendency to favour people who look like us or are similar to us in background. And ultimately, if the goal is diversity and inclusion, you can see how a bias such as the affinity bias is problematic, not only for how we behave, but also for society in general. So I think this topic of unconscious bias is really important, because biases, when they're not causing problems, and some of them don't, it's fine. But when they are contributing towards problems, it's really important that we focus on not only on understanding them, but also on trying to look at ways to overcome them.
Thanks. It's fascinating. We're basically just talking about these mental shortcuts, which we're applying all the time. It's almost basically just how we think, isn't it? So, and we're quite good. One of the things we're quite good at doing as humans is labeling things, and you get a sense that the bias, your unconscious bias in and of itself has actually got a bit of unconscious bias about it. Brian, I know you're fascinated by why we have biases, how they're created, the scaffolding around that we create throughout our lives, and what influences this. And I think we need to position this around the systems of thinking, and particularly some of the work that Kahneman's done around this. I think that's a really helpful foundation to work from.
Yes, thanks. I think Daniel Kahneman, who, for those of you who don't know Kahneman, he's the world's greatest living psychologist, I would say. And he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which was brilliant. But he also, and I think this is highly relevant to put up front, he won the Nobel Prize for economics. Now, he's not an economist, but he's a psychologist. But he demonstrated, as with all of us, that about 90% of the decisions we make are made by our unconscious brain. Now, he and many, many other scientists have demonstrated that the brain has, for want of a better description, a dual processor. And this is thinking fast, thinking slow. You have system 1, system 2. And basically, system 2 has got very limited capacity, and that is your working memory. It's your sort of conscious awareness. It's your being present in the moment. And Kahneman analogized this, that if your system 2 was the size of a cubic foot, a shoebox, then your system 1 would be the size of the Milky Way. Now, you have 100 billion neurons. Each neuron can have up to 20 or 30,000 connections. So system 2, which is your thinking rational brain, your thinking brain, is relatively small capacity. System 1 is vast. And not only is it vast, but it encodes everything that's ever happened. And it lays down that learning in little associative neural networks. And it's basically got encoded into those databases everything you've ever done. And we've all had different experiences. We've all got different genetic templates. And so our own system 1 is unique, and uniquely unique, because it's got in there what's upset us and what makes us happy and what we think is right and wrong, etc. And these are often inculcated by the environment in which we grow. So these are sort of osmosed, and we just develop these, and we're unaware of them. But the really key issue here is that system 2, when it's faced with a problem, actually receives the answer from system 1. So if I ask you the capital of France, you'll say Paris, because system 1 gives system 2 the answer. If you put a chess grandmaster in a room with 100 people playing chess, he looks or she looks at the chessboard and says, move your bishop to queen's 3, checkmate. That is a pattern matching process that goes through this fast neural circuit, and that fast neural circuit then gives system 2 the answer. But there's a catch. The catch is that system 2 is unaware that system 1 gave it the answer, and it's also unaware of its unawareness. And that's why Kahneman called it the secret author. And I think he described this as an extraordinary format of a cognitive efficiency. And 99 times out of 100, it's really good. So if you're a historian or a neurosurgeon or a pilot or a taxi driver or a fireman, you're using all that past database to give you the first answer. And that can be really helpful. You don't have to relearn it or rework it out. System 2 is hard work. It takes effort and calories to use system 2, but system 1 is very fast. So one of the problems here is that as soon as you say to somebody that they have some bias, you create some dissonance because system 2 is unaware of its bias. And if you create cognitive dissonance, which is a very well described psychological construct, if you create cognitive dissonance, people tend to do one of two things with it. They either say, that's really interesting, tell me more about that. What am I doing? How does it work? And this is what Elle was talking about, which is openness to experience and cognitive flexibility. But a lot of us, when we're challenged and our beliefs are challenged, our scaffolding, our infrastructure, our past experience is challenged, it feels very uncomfortable. So what we often do is just say rubbish. We reject it, we dismiss it, we ridicule it. And I think this is one of the problems that's happening at the moment, is we're conflating two things. We're conflating unconscious bias training not working with, or in some cases not working, with the presence of unconscious bias. And that is very unfortunate, because we have it and we need to work out ways of dealing with it.
Absolutely. We certainly have it. And I think like the point around cognitive dissonance brings me on to this. I think this quite neatly links into the link between unconscious bias and psychological health. And one of the, I suppose the heuristic or bias that we look at and we consider and we build into all that we look at is around emotion and the affect heuristic. And this is I mean, the mother of all biases, really, isn't it, or the father? So it's this is something that I think we look at in a lot of detail, and it's something that impacts on all decisions and all judgments that we make, and it's what creates that dissonance. Brian, it'd be good to understand a bit more about the affect heuristic, because I think this holds the key to actually the sort of modification process that we're gonna get into.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating area. So the affect heuristic is that moods and emotions, and moods are sort of emotion light, moods and emotions change how we think, feel, and behave. And they do that, and we know this, they do that through system 1. So they utilize this fast track. And this was brought to life really by a guy called Aaron T. Beck, who was a psychiatrist working in America using psychoanalytical therapy and medication. And what he was fascinated by was he was seeing these people with anxiety and depression. And when they were anxious, they would think about themselves as being very vulnerable, the world was dangerous, the future was spooky and uncertain. And then he would see patients with depression, and they would see themselves as useless and worthless, the world is a miserable place, and the future is dismal. But what fascinated him was that when he saw them and their mood had improved, they didn't think like that. And so he identified that mood biases your cognition. And so when I'm sad, I have sad thoughts, but my sad thoughts make me feel more sad. And we can get stuck into that dynamic very quickly. And what I think was fascinating is he then took this concept and he thought, well, if we modify cognition, thoughts and images, and if we modify behaviors, will that shift the mood? Well, the rest is history. This is a fantastically effective treatment. I mean, it's more effective in the treatment of mild to moderate depression or anxiety, panic disorder, OCD, PTSD than any medication on the planet. But the reason it's so surprising is that emotion has this huge feeling of rightness. I mean, when you're feeling angry, you're having angry thoughts, but those angry thoughts feel right. And when you're frightened, those fearful thoughts feel right. So this has a feeling of rightness that's deeply embedded in it. And what Beck did, which I think is fascinating, is he got people to write down their primary appraisal that was coming from system one. And this was their cognitive bias, if you like. So the mood is driving the thinking. And he asked them to capture what he called negative automatic thoughts. And he'd ask them to write them down as homework. He'd get them to record them. And then he would encourage them to be curious, interested, and see thoughts as thoughts. Thoughts aren't facts. I'm having the thought that. And then he'd ask them to step further back and reappraise their thoughts with a sort of second opinion on second thoughts, or what would I be saying to a friend in this situation? So creating a counsel for the defense, but that had to engage system two, and that is effortful. And a lot of people find that doing that is uncomfortable. But I think the seriously exciting thing about this is that the RCTs, the randomized controlled trials, the meta-analyses, show that this not only changes the cognition and the behavior, but it improves the clinical condition. But it is also a fantastic way of shifting bias. And I think this is a life skill. I think one of the sad things about our world at the moment is we wait for people to be ill before we treat them with this. We should be putting this stuff, this needs to be part of our educational system. So we learn how to do this, because it's a fantastic way for shifting bias.
And I think we're seeing that shift in the psychological health space, and we've seen it probably move the most in the last year. And I think it's not being problem focused, being solution focused, being proactive, and integrating it into all parts of your life, because there's not a part of your life that doesn't touch. And actually, the processes that you're talking about in unconscious bias training have their foundation in everything, really. So I mean, it's essentially coming back to how your brain operates. So I mean, I think what I think is fascinating about this is that there is a proven model through cognitive and behavioral techniques that has shifted the affect heuristic and made improvements around mood state, around anxiety, around depression. I mean, that is huge room for optimism around this, that it can be achieved, it can be done. Elle, I'd love to just think about the skills that we're talking about there, because we look at, how do you make these, how do you actually embed these skills within leaders, within teams, within organizations? Could you just pick up on one or two of those skills that Brian's talking about there?
Yeah, sure. So I think with these sort of cognitive and behavioral techniques, what ultimately we're trying to do is sort of build certain capacities, certain skills in ourselves in order to then sort of challenge these unhelpful patterns of thinking. So we talk a lot at Positive about cognitive flexibility, which is this ability to modify or shift how you think. And people with good levels of cognitive flexibility, once they identify the situational triggers or the sort of unhelpful or biased thinking, what they're able to do is be open to new ways of thinking, be curious about their thoughts. They're able to take on board different perspectives, different angles, and essentially the data which is causing the bias, they're able to update that data set, for one of a better phrase. So they're able to take on board new information, new perspectives, and challenge those ways of thinking. So this cognitive flexibility is a transferable skill. So it's something that's really implicated in CBT, cognitive behavioral techniques. It's implicated in things like creativity, in perspective taking, on getting along with others, creativity. So it's a really, really useful skill.
And I think, and also I think the link between cognitive flexibility and tolerance of uncertainty is also very relevant right now, and that's been shown to have big impact on our levels of health, but also a huge impact on performance as well. So I mean, I think what I think would be really interesting is if we have this situation where there's a proven model around identifying and then modifying biases, which are some of the most challenging biases, linked to the affect heuristic, as we've just discovered and uncovered. One of the biggest questions, I think, is why does this work, and what can we learn from that can then be transferred into the workplace? And I think one of the things we talk about a lot at Positive is, how do you make that leap into into organizations from very well researched, evidenced approaches. And Brian, I'd love to just think about, you've obviously worked a lot in medicine and CBT. What is the what's the reason that it works for individuals? What's the motivation there around particularly cognitive and behavioral techniques?
Well, I think when you've got a psychological problem, it's often devastating to your quality of life. It has tentacles into almost every aspect of your being. So people are highly motivated to try and find something that will help. So I think most people who go for psychological input would be very well motivated. So we need to put that into the equation. I think what's interesting now is, with all the evidence from neuroscience, cognitive, behavioral, social psychology, is that we now know that your psychological health correlates very, very powerfully with your cognitive function, your concentration, your memory, your executive skills. It correlates with your physical health. We could talk about that for many hours. Incredible correlation. Correlates with your behavior, how you relate to your fellow man and woman, correlates to your longevity. So I think it also increases a sense of self-efficacy and autonomy and quality of life. But I suppose the danger is we just focus on cognition and behavior. I think there's what's called third wave CBT. There's things like mindfulness, there's things like acceptance and commitment. And I think BCT is very important. This concept of changing patterns of behavior can then change cognition, because we discover that our previous belief was distorted or erroneous. And then I think, just finally, social groups. I think the power of the group. I mean, we've just seen the Lord Chief Justice who did the Stephen Lawrence inquiry recently died, but there's a classic example of institutional racism. And human beings, I think you have to address social learning affect here. What's the impact of what the group says? Because group display rules are incredibly predictive of how we all behave. So I think there are a number of factors there. But I would emphasize, this is not a panacea. Not everyone engages with it or enjoys it or can stick at it. So it's not the whole answer, but we need to pull as many levers as we possibly can.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that the cultural and social aspect a bit more in a second. I mean, I think that is one of the big challenges, isn't it, around the unconscious bias training, is that, we know that there needs to be a big what's in it for me factor around any learning. We're very interested in ourselves, and what are we going to get out of this? And I think that the cost benefit analysis of not seeking CBT when you have severe anxiety, or it's going to be destroying your life. So I think just looking at this through a lens of what's in it for the individual, and I think that's where the psychological health lens does offer an opportunity to think about this differently. But I also Brian, I know you're and Elle, so particularly your research around this is fascinating, but looking at really sort of where the responsibility lies, and where do the levers of change sit, particularly within the workplace and the organization, because I think quite a lot of emphasis is put on the individual, and we've talked a lot about the individual through this process of cognitive and behavioral techniques and change. But we also know that the power of social learning is far greater, and some of the brilliant work around behavioral economics and some of Dan Ariely's studies and so on, it's just show us, and the like, show us, the fantastic impact of social learning, and particularly when that's demonstrated by leadership. Any thoughts on that quickly, Brian? And I'd love to come to you in a second on the data there. Oh.
Yeah, I think this whose responsibility is it is fascinating. I think again, if you can focus this in, I suppose for me, I didn't know this stuff when I went through medical school. I learned it when I did psychology, health psychology, and trained in cognitive and behavioral psychology. And suddenly you see a door open to something. I thought, why wasn't I taught this? I think if psychological education in and of itself is protective. But as soon as you start to gain those insights, it informs the cost benefit analysis. And I think that links back to your motivation question, because it's no different to exercise and diet for people who want to stay physically healthy. This data should be in the public domain. I think the second bit about social learning is those cultural display rules. What's valued, what's rewarded in the group that you're working with and being with. And I think if you just address individuals, it's going to have a very weak effect. And we know we're more Homo imitans than Homo sapiens. And the best predictor of human behavior is what other people are doing. And I think the danger with focusing on the individual, it's a cop-out sometimes for the organization not to look at the cultural display rules that are going on in their own. So I think you have to address both synchronously.
Absolutely, and they're hugely predictive of patterns of behavior. Elle, any thoughts on that? From, I think, your research recently has really focused in on role modeling, and particularly leadership behaviors, and how that influences this.
Yeah, sure. So I think so what we ultimately are trying to do at Positive is trying to embed psychological health within organisations, and we do that by working with individuals through psychoeducation, but we also do it from a top-down perspective, so working with leadership groups. So we're really interested around, so how do you actually embed change? So this is in relation typically to psychological health. So how do you embed psychological health within culture so that the majority of individuals within an organisation will feel like it's part of culture? And when we analyse the data around that, so I look at team, manager, sort of mid-leadership and senior leadership levels. So what are the most important levers? Are they all important, or are there particular things that emerge? And what we see is at this the most senior leadership level, whether they are role modeling change and whether they are showing things for a priority, is the biggest factor in embedding psychological health within culture. I think there's so many parallels between psychological health and diversity and inclusion in terms of their progress within organisations and where they're at in terms of their stage of so just never underestimate the importance of role models in that really senior group who are consistent across the organisation.
Brilliant, thank you, Elle. I'm just aware we've only got a couple of minutes left. So I mean, I think what we could talk about each of these parts for a long time, and I know we do. But what I'm hearing is that there's I think how we think about bias is so important, and actually accepting that this impacts on absolutely everything, as you say, Brian. This is about life skills. These are mental shortcuts. And actually, many of them are hugely helpful, and some of them, and actually only quite a small percentage of them cause us challenges, individually and collectively. There's sort of three things I think that are coming out of the process around that. One is around that that awareness piece and that understanding, which links into your particularly into System 1. System 2, and good psychoeducation can really start us off in a great direction around this. And I think that's actually a part that's really improving, and lots of organizations are doing very, very well. And the second part is which I think is the real challenge, is about the application of this and the action and the doing. How do we know from CBT that most of the impact comes from the individual going away and applying the techniques and practicing. So how do you create a culture of learning? And I think this is what organizations are really looking at now. This is partly how you future-proof. I mean, there's so much at the moment around how you're having, people are going to have to reinvent themselves so often with the pace of change now. And these skills are just central to future skills and adaptation, and a lot of the skills that are now have jumped up over those harder skills into this place. And that third piece, which I think is a real challenge, is looking at how do you motivate this, how do you incentivize this, how do you get it right. And I think that's about thinking about what's in it for the individual, because we are often selfish utility maximizers. So we've got to come at it from the individual perspective. And then also, I think as you touched on, and some of those experiments, like Ash's experiment around cultural display rules, we do imitate and we do pick up the behavior within the groups that we in the environments within which we operate. And back to your research there, El, in terms of creating those right leadership role modeling those right behaviors. But I think there's what I'm also hearing is there's just huge room for optimism. I think the conversation around this has gone so far so quickly, and the science shows that things can really be done. Any final thoughts from either of you guys on that?
I suppose I'd just say that your point about room for optimism is a really good note to end on, because I think this is a transferable skill. We know we have unconscious bias. We have unconscious bias with knobs on when our moods and emotions are driving the show. We can modify that. It's not a perfect system, but we can modify it. Learning how to modify it. There's masses of data that shows it's effective, and we should be learning from the data and the evidence of what works.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, look, thank you very much, El. Thank you very much, Brian. I really enjoyed that conversation. We just ran over, but I'm not surprised with this topic. So very nearly did it. Thank you everyone for joining us. If anyone wants to learn more about Positive, what we do, and in particular the programs we run for organizations, do please get in touch with us, info@positivegroup.org, and get in touch with Brian, myself, or El at any time. Thank you again for joining us. We'll let you know about the next webinar, and hopefully you can join us then. Many thanks all.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.